The scope and range of this year's CONVOCO forum is rather enormous and alarming, especially if you have to make the concluding remarks. We've discussed in the last few days. We've discussed crises in finance and in the economy, crises of democratic legitimacy, crises of populism, political crises, and also, perhaps most importantly, the climate crisis. All the things that Corinne Flick mentioned in her introduction. So, not only are these very, very difficult, complex subjects, in some of them independent of each other, but they're also subjects of great practical significance, of the greatest practical significance. I'm a philosopher, so it falls upon me to follow Socrates, who said that all I know is that I know nothing. So since I know nothing, that won't stop me from giving my opinions about today's forum. I'd like to isolate here a few highlights, but I think the first question that must face us in discussing things like this is how we can do anything about these crises. By we, I mean primarily thinkers, intellectuals, scholars, economists, historians, philosophers, other scientists. What can we do to address the crises that are the subject of this year's forum? And it's very natural to feel powerless, impotent in the face of these things. However, I think we have to address them because we have to understand them. And understanding is a matter of trying to clarify, trying to identify what the different parts of these phenomena are. And in order to do that, I think we need to do two things. The first is that we need to address these questions dispassionately, and we need to have a sense of perspective. We need to make sure that our contributions are not parochial, that we're not just looking at things from our own case and generalizing from our own case. To take my own case, I was born in 1962. So I lived through a period in Europe of unprecedented peace for most of the inhabitants of Europe. The history of Europe before that was the history of war. I lived in the most peaceful period of European history. I feel very fortunate to be in that position. And it might be natural to generalize to this and say, well, this was a sign of kind of a teleology, sort of a progress, a movement towards something. And some people thought like this. So some people thought when the Cold War finished that this was the end of history, as it was sometimes said. This is the point at which we'd reached where we were arriving to with the progress that we had made. Now, this would be a narrow and parochial view, not only because in the period of my life, growing up in the relatively privileged war-free part of the world, there were many wars going on elsewhere in the world, but also because there was no such progress. And things started to collapse, as we've seen in this afternoon's discussion. So the historians will tell us, as Professor Leonhard did, that there hasn't really been a period without crisis, and I'm sure that's true. But that doesn't mean that all crises are the same, or that there's no reason to look at the individual crises we have now. And this brings me to my second point about what we can do as intellectuals or thinkers, is that we need to break these things down into their parts. Adam Tooze's concept of polycrisis is a nice catchphrase or catchword to sum this whole thing up. But it's not a very good explanatory tool. It doesn't help explain what's going on in these different situations. We have many different problems. The world is facing many different problems. and they all need different individual explanations. So I think this is where we need to start. We need to start with a sense of perspective, and then we need to try and break down the individual problems. With that said, I'd like to make 4 small points about things that struck me about today's discussion. The first is about the idea of a system, the idea of the world, the global world order. The second is about values, the values that their systems are supposed to embody. The third will be about the climate crisis, and the fourth will be about the concept of truth or fact. I think Corinne Flick was right when she said this afternoon that we're entering a period of history where the things are not going to be the same. Maybe that's always true, but there's a striking way in which things seem to not be the same. And I think one of the lessons from the discussions today is that there are very plausible reasons to think that these systems that we're talking about, those systems, the rule-governed systems, which were part of the post-war consensus, are in many ways ineffective. And maybe many of them will soon have had their day. And maybe the whole idea that goes along with this, the whole idea of the West, insofar as that idea embodies these systems of the United Nations, the World Bank, and these things, maybe the idea of the West has had its day too. Maybe we should stop thinking in terms of the West. Maybe there's too many differences between the different parts of the West. If Donald Trump gets in next year and takes the United States further and further away from the path that it had been set on, then there will be even less in common between what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the United States. Maybe. But maybe this is a good thing. Maybe we shouldn't place our faith in these systems, but we have to think of other ways in which to tackle these crises. This brings me to the second point, because I think it would be a mistake to think that the values which we associate with Western liberal democracies are necessarily dependent on having systems like this. These values I mean values like equality, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of thought, democracy, maybe even things like free trade and things like this. These values are things which are independent of these particular structures. And that should be obvious, but I think it needs to be said. And this is a part of my job. I see it as a philosopher, is to state the obvious when necessary. We shouldn't think that the fact that the systems are under threat means that the values which the systems were in some ways trying to spread across the world, democracy, perhaps the idea of human rights. I mean, these values do not depend on there being such systems. The values are something which we should cultivate and defend and articulate ourselves, and that the last two CONVOCO forums were on equality and on freedom. So we shouldn't think that the threat to the global world order, or the liberal world order, or whatever we want to call it, is a threat to the values that it's trying to promote. That's my second point. Those values could remain even if the concept of the West loses its applicability. My third point is about the climate crisis, and here I think it's just, this is a reason to be very pessimistic, what we've learnt about this crisis. And how hard it will be to do anything without any kind of international agreement, how to make any real progress. So once again, this is a problem which is going to be independent of anything that happens in relation to the decline of the institutions or the systems. The final point I want to make, though, is reflecting on something that Wolfgang Schön said in the earlier discussion, which is that it's brought out particularly in the case of the climate crisis, is that we will not make any progress, we will not get anywhere. And by we, I mean all of us. I don't mean academics, intellectuals, thinkers, economists, but I also mean politicians and business people, ordinary citizens. We will not make any progress at all unless we can maintain the distinction between fact and fiction, between truth and falsehood, and between what's real and what's not real. People may have their own opinions, but people don't have their own facts, as Wolfgang said. The facts are out there, people have different opinions about the facts. Unless we can keep this distinction in mind, unless we can distinguish between fact and fiction, between truth and falsehood, then we won't get anywhere but we won't get anywhere in addressing any of these crises. Of course, it's very difficult sometimes to know what the difference is between the truth and the falsehood. That's a hard thing to find out. That's what science is about. It's trying to find out what is true. No one's saying that it's easy to do that, but the fact that it's difficult to do it should not make you reject the distinction. And I think none of these crises can be dealt with at all unless we have in our minds a clear and absolutely unbending sense of the difference between the true and the false. That's my final point. Thank you very much.